Liability has become a pretty big part of our culture today. You hear lots about it. A few years, well, I guess it's decades now, there's a huge lawsuit against big tobacco companies. Remember, because they had known, it turned out, they seemed to prove that they had known that it was harmful to people's health, but they'd carried on as though that weren't the case, and they weren't telling people, and they were indicating that it was fine, it was good for you, it won't hurt you. So literally millions, hundreds of millions, possibly billions of dollars to settle those lawsuits. The reason I sort of know a little bit about that is from reading John Grisham. So Grisham writes all kinds of stuff, like there's a book about torts, which is, several of his books kind of talk about torts, which is these kind of mass lawsuits against mostly pharmaceutical companies, but also automobile companies for some kind of harm to people on a big scale. So those things are out there, huge settlements happening. Remember the O.J. Simpson case? Now there's a peculiarity, because if you remember the O.J. Simpson case, he won the criminal trial but lost the lawsuit for killing his wife and the other gentleman. So the criminal court found him not guilty, but the lawsuit fined him for the crime. It's like, what? How does that work? Our churches now have to have a lot of liability coverage. We do here. And that's gone up in the last few years since there have been such great concerns and lawsuits about the possible abuse of power. So we have extra coverage now. Covers, I forget what the exact term is, officers and governors or something. So it's mostly our board members and myself and teachers, like Sunday school teachers and such. We're covered in case we're found to have abused a child or something like that. So lots of that going on. A good chunk of your car insurance is about liability, if you know. And each of us has to have at least $1 million coverage. And I don't know if about your insurance company, but I'm guessing they're pushing you to get $2 million if you haven't done that already. That'll be the new gold standard, I'm pretty sure. And that's because cars are dangerous things. If you happen to hit somebody, you could damage them for the rest of their lives. You could stop their income for years to come. All those kinds of things. So that's super expensive. It adds up. It's years and years of wages, for instance. So that's what liability is there to cover. Liable, of course, is basically a legal term. The definition I found was responsible by law, legally answerable. I like that. Legally answerable. So answerable in the eyes of the law, responsible by law. Now, Jesus uses legal language in the passage that we have today. And he actually uses the word libel. And I found it interesting. So this is the part where he talks about do not murder. My translation has three different renderings for the same word in the original language. So the original language, which is best translated libel, which may be hard to understand. So answerable is probably a really good choice. But mine's got subject once, answerable once, and in danger of once. So it's got three different words. And Paul and I have heard this story for a long time. But one of the complaints about the King James Bible, back when everybody kind of left the King James Bible, was because they kept translating the same word in Hebrew or German, or Hebrew or Greek, into different words in English. So that was thought as not being very academically sound. But here's a brand new version, relatively speaking, that's doing the same thing. So what's that about? Anyway, I digress. So he uses, so this is the language. Do not murder. Anyone who murders will be liable to judgment. I tell you, anyone who's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is liable to the Sanhedrin. Anyone who says, you fool, is liable to the fire of hell. Okay, so it's all libel. 4 times he uses the word. Interesting. But why is he talking with all this legalese? He's got this kind of legal perspective going on. It's almost like he's talking about the law. And of course, if you go back to the beginning of the passage, which Nancy read earlier, this is an important part of setting the stage for the Sermon on the Mount, and also for helping us to understand Jesus. So I think we want to understand Jesus in his context, in his day. We have to get a hold of this, get kind of this teaching and this proclamation that he made about himself. So it starts in verse 17. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." Right? So Jesus is talking to this entirely Jewish congregation, audience, listeners, people that were following him and clinging to his every word. And he would be a great novelty. The way the things he began to stress and teach, and the way he unfolded the law and the prophets was quite novel. And yet he did not want them to think in the least that thing which they held so precious, namely the law. And these are the people of the book. I mean, if that's one thing that characterized the Jewish nation in Jesus' day, and in some ways still today, they were the people of the book. That's what set them aside from all the cultures around them, whether it was the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians and all these other cultures. They were the people who God had spoken to and given the law and the prophets to, which we call the Old Testament. So the Bible as they knew it, they held in high esteem. And Moses to them was sort of like, the original giver of, God used him to bring the law to them. So he was almost the equivalent to them of, Muhammad to Islam, or Buddha to the Buddhists, or even to Jesus to us in some way. So he was held in such high esteem. So here's Jesus reassuring them that no matter what you may think I'm about, I'm not about abolishing them. And I didn't come to abolish them. I came to fulfill them. In other words, they're not really complete. They're not the full story yet. They start, and I'm not going to abolish them, but I'm going to kind of blast it wide open and show you what the whole thing really means and what it's all about, and bring it to completion. And then he further stresses it. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Remember the old King James Version? Not one jot or tittle. Not the littlest bit of the language is to be done away with. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever practices and teaches these commands will be great in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Now these guys were the super best people around, okay, according to the law. They were the best behaved, according to the law, from their perspective. And everybody thought that was true. Unless you're better than them, he says, you will certainly not even enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's laying it out pretty strong here. Already I'm guessing they were kind of trying to catch their breath, like, what? We got to be better than those really, really good guys? Or we can't even enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's laying it down. So then he pulls out one of the 10 Commandments. You have heard that it was said to the ancients, you shall not murder. Now if I was to try to get you to recite for me all 10 Commandments, I wonder how many you'd get. Well, probably 5 or 6. It's surprising how many people, how people don't know them anymore. I think back in the day, and I'm not going to go there, and I'm not going to pound on you. You should know them though. But anyway, maybe back in your confirmation class, you got catechized, all that. You probably had to learn this. It used to be kind of standard fare, and it is an important part of the background to our faith, but also to our culture. I mean, it's a huge chunk. So this is one of the best known ones, and so Jesus says. It says this, do not murder. Anyone who murders will be liable to judgment. But I tell you, and that's going to be a key phrase all through the Sermon on the Mount, but I tell you. So he's saying, that it says this, and that's all well and good. But I'm going to tell you something that's a little bit more further along the path here. I'm going to fulfill it. So Jesus came to fulfill. Just a little sidebar here is, the scholars tell us that and I wouldn't have noticed this, but I've read this and I believe it, Jesus is presented as, all through the New Testament, as the new Moses. So if this Moses was such a great guy, basically the early church is saying, and Jesus himself is saying, I'm way far above that Moses guy. In fact, in the book of Hebrews, which is a letter later on in the New Testament, it says, well, Moses was great. He was a great guy. He was God's servant. But he was like the great servant over the house. But Jesus is like the owner of the house. So that's the comparison here. So one's the servant in the house, and the other one is actually the owner of the house. In this gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, Well, you remember how many books in the law there are? Anybody know offhand, other than Paul? How many books in the law? How many? 5, yes. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay? So the 5 books of Moses. They were precious. They're the foundation, the corner of the Jewish faith. The Pentateuch, when the pentagon means 5, right? Pentateuch it's called. So it had these 5 big books. Well, the Gospel of Matthew, if you analyze it carefully, it's got 5 big discourses in it. Interesting. So it's almost like the new giving of the law-ish. And then at the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, guess where Jesus goes? Up on the mount. Says, so he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them, saying, well, guess where Moses gave the law from? From up on the Mount Sinai. So Jesus is, and there's many other things like that I could show you to show you that Jesus is being presented to us as the new Moses. And he's presenting himself that way by saying, you have heard that it was said to the ancients, but I say to you. Because he's talking about the fulfillment of it. Now, what was the point of that commandment? Thou shalt not murder. You shall not murder. You shall not kill. Is that what God's after? He wants a wonderful society of human beings who are so great they don't kill each other anymore. What a high goal. Well, in some places in the world and sometimes in the world, that's meant if we could just get that, we'd be happy, right? But really, that's all? And Jesus is saying, no. The fulfillment of that is something far deeper, far greater, far more wonderful. And it's not just don't kill, but he says, I tell you, don't be angry with each other. Now, I'm not even going to get, there's a textual variant in this that could cause us another hour of lecture. You want to do that? No. You know what a textual variant is? So these things were written down in the first century by scribes, by Matthew in the first place, and then people copied it. They didn't have photocopiers. And so then the copies went off in all directions, and people copied the copies, and so on. So if you go back, there are a few things that are not exactly the same in all those old ancient texts. One is that they have added in an extra word here in some, the most ancient ones. It says, who is angry without cause with his brother, is what some. So the most ancient ones say without cause, but the majority don't say that. So then the scholars have a big battle. What do we put, one or the other? So they usually put one and put the footnote of the other in the bottom of your Bible, so it'll be there. But anyway, we'll leave that as it is. I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. So Jesus, now, he takes the same words that he just said about murder. Whoever murders will be liable to judgment. I tell you, whoever's angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. And what would be judgment for them? You remember what the penalty was when you were found guilty of murder back in the Old Testament times? Stoned to death, right? You'd be killed. So eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. That's the law. And Jesus says, same thing for being angry. Oh. That's a high cost. Anyone who says to his brother, Raka. Now we're not sure, that's some Aramaic thing. It means something like empty or something. Is answerable or liable to the Sanhedrin. Now, you look at these, there's three ways he says anger is serious stuff. I think, now that there's different interpretations and different people have different ideas, I think they're parallel to each other. In fact, it's just Jesus uses different ways because he's a great poet. He's the world's best poet. And if you look through the Gospels, he talks in poetic language all the time. So there's 3 colorful ways in which he's telling us about our anger. Now, we could get into the argument, well, some anger's got to be good, right? And doesn't the Bible teach us some anger is good? And I think there's a good case to be made for that. There is, I think, a righteous kind of anger that is useful and helpful and good for people. But most of our anger isn't that. Most of our anger is self-centered. It's mean-spirited. It just starts a big row and puts us in the face of somebody and divides relationships. So it's destructive anger in most of the cases of our anger. And so there's a whole lot more in the New Testament about watch out for your anger, don't be angry, take away all wrath, be careful, keep the rage off, all that stuff. There's a lot more talk about that, and it kind of goes with what Jesus is saying here. So, but 3 ways, he says, be liable to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is liable to the Sanhedrin. You know what that is? So that's like the high council of Israel. So it's like the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court of Israel is called the Sanhedrin, and met in Jerusalem. And Jesus says you could end up going to the Sanhedrin. You think, well, it's a big deal. What power do they have? Well, they didn't have power to kill people, but they had power to turn you over to the Romans who could kill you. And guess who that happened to? Yeah, exactly. Happened to Jesus himself. So it's interesting. It's ironic, but that this is Jesus in the early stages of his ministry is saying you could get turned over to the Sanhedrin, and people are like, what? We're up in Galilee. But that's exactly what happened to Jesus, and he got turned over to the Romans, and he got put to death. But anyone who says you fool, now the original word in the Greek is the word that we get moron from. So somebody read it in Inglesby this morning, that they actually had that translation. Anyone who says moron will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now this is the first time we find any talk of what gets translated hell here in the New Testament. It's the first use of that language by Jesus. The word is Gehenna, and basically it's in their minds. So I'm going to not even go near all the conversation about, is hell this eternal place where the devil sits and tortures and torments people for all eternity? I'm not sure if that's... Certainly, I don't think what's in mind here by Jesus when he speaks this. So that's a theological debate that we'd have to go on another couple hours about. So the Gehenna is the dump outside of Jerusalem. It's the valley of Gehenna, a valley of Hinnom or Gehenna. And that's where they dumped all the waste from this big city. And they burned it all the time. And so Jesus talks about, he says, where the flame is not quenched and the worm does not die. It's just rotting away in there, and it's burning in there all the time. And some of you may remember the days when you went to the dump, and it was burning all the time. The smoke was coming up from the dump 24/7. Used to be like that in Minden and Halliburton, back when most of us were kids. And now, I guess that's environmentally wrong. So we've learned that that's not something we should do. But of course, the pattern in the world through many millennia has been that's what people do with the refuse. They just burn it. So this is a very colorful expression. You're going to end up there. That's what you're going to end up with if you call your brother a moron. So Jesus, at the very least, is seriously taking us to task for the expressions of our anger against one another. And he's using very colorful language, powerful, and I think it's parallels, kind of, what's the word, synonymous parallelism, I think. So not only that, so first of all, he goes at us very strongly, expanding on the law to say this is what it really is about, not just killing, forget that, anger. But then he goes on to talk about when people are angry at you. This is when you're angry with somebody. But then the next 2 chunks are when somebody's angry at you, and there's 2 big chunks. If you're going to worship, offering your gift at the altar, and remember somebody has something against you, stop, forget your worship for the time being, go back and get that settled, reconciled with your brother, and then come back to worship. Right? So how would you do that? How would you get reconciled if someone had something against you in our thinking? You'd go apologize, and try to get right with them. It's okay. Or and the next one is actually when more serious matters. Somebody's got a lawsuit against you. Here it is again. So your adversary who is taking you to court. He says on the way to the court, you better have a chat with them and get it worked out because you could end up in jail and you won't get out till you pay the last penny. So he's very seriously telling us to make it right with people who have something against you and they're angry with you. So it kind of works, it's working both ways. At the heart, this is all about us learning to get along with each other. It's learning to live in community. It's learning to love your neighbor. It's learning to deal with offenses as they come and as they go from you. And you can be a peacemaker from both sides. You can be a peacemaker for yourself by learning how to keep yourself in check in your anger, and you can help diffuse the other guy's anger toward you. And that's a pretty far cry from don't kill people, don't murder. It's way far beyond it. Jesus is setting up his kingdom in his way. Now, this is the law. And this is why it's upsetting and difficult to listen to. It's hard. But, see, God uses these two tools to bring about the redemption of the human race, the law and the gospel. And the law is saying, my friends, this is what you're supposed to be doing. And you're liable for it when you're not. And the gospel is saying, yeah, but you can't. You don't. And so you need a lot of help. And you need a lot of forgiveness. And you need a lot of compassion and intervention and inner strengthening. And that's the gospel that Christ came to preach and to unfold for us. And the cross is about this, about God releasing good news to us so that the law is actually written in our hearts. So this kind of thing that's written here is not such a burden to bear. It seems right and it makes sense and it clicks with our new who we are. So, and if you think about this a little bit, I mean, say either someone perhaps drops their hammer on your toe or hits your child with his car. I mean, these are pretty serious things, but one's not a very serious thing, and the other one's quite a serious deal. How do I not be angry? Right? And the answer is, the only answer, which is underneath, it's an undercurrent in this whole thing. There's only one way you can not be angry with somebody who's done something horrible to you, and that is that you will have to forgive them. I mean, the two are implicit, or her. But where do I get the resources to forgive somebody that has done something horrible to me? And the answer, of course, is only by God's grace can I do that. And that's why we continue to preach the gospel of Christ and of the cross, because basically that's where God comes and forgives us completely, entirely through the blood of Christ. Through trust in Christ, our slates are washed clean forever. We're entirely, completely, utterly forgiven for all offenses, all wrong thoughts, wrong deeds, wrong feelings, wrong intentions, wrong motivations, wrong actions, and failure to do the things we should have done. Completely forgiven through the blood of Christ. And that's why we keep going back to that, because unless we grasp that, we haven't got the resources to forgive somebody else. But when we get that, then we begin to get, and Jesus will really hammer this home as the gospel unfolds. The Gospel of Matthew unfolds, a whole parable about this. And he calls us to that, to find that resource, our forgiveness, that we might forgive others. So Jesus lays out the law pretty fiercely, strictly, but the gospel is embedded here. It's embedded here. It says you can't not be angry unless you forgive. You can't forgive without God's grace. So and besides that, the one you've done wrong to, the one you and I have hurt, can't be reconciled to you unless they forgive. So whenever someone does something wrong, or you do something wrong to somebody, and you go and ask them you go and apologize, right? Has anybody ever apologized to anybody? I hope you have. I'm not going to make you put up your hands, but by golly, if you haven't, you're missing something somewhere, because we've all offended people a lot. The older we get, the more so, And so hopefully we've all been there where we've gone and apologized. And what we're doing when we apologize to somebody is implicitly we're seeking them to forgive us. And they can do one of two things. They can say, no problem, and they forgive us. Or they can say, I don't care what you say, I'm never speaking to you for as long as I live. And they don't forgive you, right? And both of those happen. And both of those probably have happened to most of us. So when we go to somebody to ask forgiveness or to apologize, we're pushing them to find the gospel resource too. We're pushing them toward the grace of God in Christ, because they're confronted with the need to forgive you, which I think is an interesting thing that Jesus puts in this sermon. So we stand in liability before God and each other. We are legally answerable and accountable under God for our actions, our words, and according to Jesus, our feelings, because anger is a feeling. In the Alpha Course, there's a great story told by Nicky Gumbel, the guy that kind of teaches Alpha. And I'm not sure whether it's a true story or not, but he's a lawyer, so it might be. It's a law story, a court story. So in the story, there's two boys that grow up together. They're just fast friends. They love each other dearly. And they spend all the time they can together. And then as the years unfold, they drift apart. And the one drifts off to a life of, kind of crime. And the other drifts off and becomes a judge. So sure enough, one day later on, as they're all grown men, one is sitting in the seat of is a judge, and the other one gets brought into court for crime that he's committed, serious theft. And he's convicted of this, and now it's either go to jail for a long period of time or pay this very high price, this very high fine. And this judge, who recognizes this fella as his childhood friend and loves him dearly, is in a dilemma. So they have to keep justice, but also they love their old childhood friend. So in the story, what he does is he takes his judge's robe off, goes down to the bottom of the court, goes over to the clerk, and entirely pays off the fine for this guy. And he gives him a big hug and says, "Glad to see you, friend." And on his way, he goes with the debt paid. And he was just using that to say this is a parable or metaphor for what God has done in Christ. He's paid the debt for us, that we might be forgiven. He's taken his anger off and away from us, that we might do the same for others. For us to live life fully, for us to actually love each other the way Jesus calls us to, we desperately need to drink deeply and often from God's deep, deep well of love and forgiveness. And after all, this is Valentine's week, so shall we pray?